I want to welcome you to the Art History 2063 C3 Symposium keynote talk. I'm John Corso-Esquivel, and I teach art history here, and I have offered my genuine thanks to so many people that made this possible at both the morning and the afternoon panel. So with your forgiveness, I'm going to offer just my abbreviated thanks, but my genuine gratitude to our insightful guests who have been delivering fantastic papers today, and to our keynote who is going to be giving us quite a lot to think about as we consider where the field is going to be moving. And I'd like to also thank my very kind colleagues for great support throughout this process. I would like to move now to introducing our keynote. And Dr. Padilla Peralta was born in the Dominican Republic and grew up in New York City. He attended the collegiate school in New York before going to Princeton, where he delivered the Latin salutatory for his graduating class. He attended Oxford as a Sachs Scholar and then completed his doctorate in classics at Stanford. Before joining the faculty of Princeton, Dr. Padilla served as a fellow in the humanities at Columbia University. His 2015 memoir, Undocumented, A Dominican Boy's Odyssey from a Homeless Shelter to the Ivy League, is a riveting story that recounts Professor Padilla's path from a childhood bookworm to an internationally renowned classicist. The story brings critical attention to the challenges undocumented students in the US face, and he's become an outspoken advocate and inspiration for dreamers in the US. He was one of 3 co-editors of Rome, Empire, and of Plunder, The Dynamics of Cultural Appropriation, which looks at a wide range of cultural appropriation in Roman imperial culture, from literature to theater. Finally, in 2020, his book published by Princeton University Press, Divine Institutions, Religions, and Community in the Middle Roman Republic, charts a particularly understudied area of ancient Roman history. In a review of the book, Professor Krasimir Vukovic writes that Professor Padilla is a rising star of the classics in the USA. He notes that the book considers people from all strata of Roman society, and he also complements the book's novel methodologies, which incorporate quantitative methods along with qualitative narratives. Patrick Madigan of Oxford further writes that the book complicates the modern historical narrative that obsesses over Rome's military and political structures. Divine Institutions offers a much needed corrective that places the role of religious activity and devotional culture as crucial to the history of the Middle Roman Republic and its later developments. Most relevant to our symposium today, Dr. Padilla Peralta was the subject of a major feature in the New York Times Magazine, which was very provocatively entitled, "He Wants to Save Classics from Whiteness. Can the Field Survive?" Since the field of art history has similarly problematic histories of Eurocentrism, classism, colonial, and racist epistemologies, it seemed like a great opportunity to invite Professor Padilla Peralta to help us reflect on the future of our discipline. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Padilla Peralta. Thank you.
I will take off the mask. Okay. So I want to start by thanking everyone who's made today's proceedings possible. I want to extend my special and heartiest gratitude to the presenters for the sessions earlier today, from whose papers I learned a huge amount, and whose papers I'm still trying to process. Much of the reflections that I'll attempt to center for our conversation tonight I see as engaging with some of the concerns floated in the papers earlier today. And I hope that the lines of analysis that I venture in this keynote do justice to the sensitivity and rigor with which your presentations model critique. I am particularly grateful I'm going to move myself in a moment as I try to log into my laptop. I'm particularly grateful to John for extending the invitation to join you all tonight. And I have to say that I was quite flattered and taken aback by the invitation, because I thought, well, what will I have to offer folks reflecting on the futures of art history? I hope that the talk outlined some ways in which the product of classicism, understood as a structure for the designation and distribution of value, has some responsibility for and stewardship of contemporary conversations afoot in art historical adjacent contexts. But I should start by noting that one of the things that, for all the honor that came with the New York Times Magazine piece, I found difficult to stomach was, in fact, the title of this piece, because I have zero desire to save anyone or anything. I mean, this is something that we might want to subject to closer scrutiny in the Q&A. How do we enter into relationships of stewardship and responsibility with our disciplines that are not predicated on salvific logics? What does this look like? What might this demand of us? That's something of interest to me, and I hope will be of interest to those of you here tonight. By training an ancient Mediterranean historian and student of classical reception, in recent years, I've been striving with coworkers in the field to build up an infrastructure for disciplinary futures that moves beyond the white centering and white normative gazes around which the study of classics and, relatedly, classicism has been historically predicated. For today, I'm going to explore the construction of future-facing projects that, proceeding from the recognition of classicism as a technology for the assignment and commodification of value, as I mentioned earlier, moves to the refinement of this technology in the service of historically minoritized communities and groups. I see the history of the field of classics and of its disciplinary kin, such as classical art history, as a masterclass, a term I use intentionally, in how to transform an object of study into a system of authority. Facing up to this history of transformation, I propose we seek out ways of redistributing authority, beginning with the identification of those protocols of valuation that, built into the paradigms of classicism, can be most effectively and efficiently retooled. But I want to commence the actual substance of my paper with a land acknowledgement. As a settler of color on Lenni Lenape lands, I address those of you who reside on the lands of the Catawba people and those of you who have traveled to these lands for today's events. Embracing the call of Teresa Stewart Ambo and Kei Wayne Yang to move, quote, beyond land acknowledgement, end quote, I hope that this talk will further the project, and I quote them again, of enacting epistemologies beyond the settler present, beyond colonial sovereignty, and beyond the human, end quote. But more than anything, and as a necessary precondition for this enactment, I hope that my words and our conversations enter into and maintain a proper and faithful relationship to these lands and their traditional custodians. The talk tonight will be structured around two artists, one who is fairly well known and the other who is newly ascendant into visibility, whose interventions in the fields of Black classicism and Afro-diasporic classicism I have found to be edifying spurs towards the kinds of future visioning that challenges and displaces prevailing epistemologies in the visual arts. Corollary to the work of this future visioning is a throwdown against the citational and scholarly practices that reproduce the minoritization of select artistic communities. Elena Fitzpatrick-Sifford and Ananda Cohen-Aponte have recently issued a call to action that includes a summons, quote, to democratize our citational practices. Citation is political, end quote. They go on to explain. And as a consequence, we're under the obligation to reject those, and I'll quote them, narrow, discipline-specific citational footprints that entrench prevailing forms of racial and linguistic hegemony. Absent such rejection, I agree with them that our fields will continue to be bedeviled by epistemically constraining and materially non-progressivist practices, such as the paradox documented by Cohen-Aponte and Sifford in another publication, that even disciplines such as Latin American and Latinx visual culture, to name one example, remain dominated by white practitioners. We can multiply examples. Their point is simply that so long as we persist in reproducing an epistemics of white mastery, we will continue to see such paradoxes proliferate in the organization and constitution of fields in art history and adjacent disciplines. Another dimension of this epistemic constraint is apparent in the content of museum holdings, especially but not only in the United States. The findings of a 2019 investigation into the holdings of 18 major US museums will help orient our appreciation of the pervasiveness and salience of this constraint. Through painstaking research into museum catalogs and some nimble statistical modeling, the 9-person team responsible for the study, a screenshot of whose lead page you see on this slide, was able to determine that across the 18 major US museums as a whole, 85% of artists are white and 87% of them are men. One way to respond to these results is to agitate for deepening and widening the diversity of museum art holdings, as the authors of the report and its most sympathetically inclined readers have already done. But what I hope to stress with this talk, and what I would invite all of us to engage in conversation about afterwards, is that greater representation of historically minoritized artists and art practices is the beginning, not the end, of a progressive vision for the future. Beginning, not the end. Let me turn now to the two artists who will form the focus of my remarks tonight. The first half of my talk will focus on Kehinde Wiley, and the second half of the talk will focus on Almonia Rosales. Already well known and regarded on both sides of the Atlantic, Kehinde Wiley took a global star turn on being commissioned to paint President Barack Obama's portrait for the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. The result elicited strong and for the most part favorable reactions. Viewers were intrigued not only by the figure of the president himself, seated with his arms folded in a problem solver's pose, but by the floral background, a fixture of Wiley's portraiture, and in this instance, studded with nods to Chicago, Hawaii, and Kenya, chrysanthemums, jasmines, and African blue lilies, respectively. The pairing of artist and subject did justice to them both in the eyes of some critics. As Vincent Cunningham has written, quote, Obama, more possibly than anybody else alive, already embodies so many of the themes of representation, self-ownership, and unlikely presence that trouble Wiley's work, end quote. What stood out to me most about Wiley's portrait of Obama, though, was the significance of plaiting together two distinct yet surprisingly cognate approaches to genealogical myth-making, the one visual, the other political and autobiographical, partly through the mediation of floral signifiers that intensify the claim to specific rooted origins, even as they threaten to overturn this claim. So what do I mean by this? I'll say a few words first about Obama, whose feel for genealogical redescription as a project equal parts autobiographical and political was very much a known quantity even before he set foot in the White House, as many of you will know. In an earlier version of this project that I presented under the title Dreams from Our Fathers, I riffed appreciatively on Obama's 1995 memoir, Dreams from My Father, A Story of Race and Inheritance, where this Ralph Ellisonian enterprise of myth-making as an orientation to racial heritage and inheritance, as imposed externally and as claimed for oneself, as corporeal substance and as invisible medium, is never far from the surface. Neither in the memoir itself nor in the more than 2 decades of speaking and writing that have followed its publication were this heritage and inheritance taken as stable quantities. It's their plasticity and malleability that has come to the fore in Obama's political art, time and again, for better and for worse. Complementing the former president's knack for discerning, in my colleague Eddie Glaude's words, quote, exactly what we want and what we fear, and adjusting himself accordingly, end quote, were a set of conjurer's tricks for scripting Blackness as cultural resource, as coalitionary bulwark, as a poetics of power. These scripts were flavored with upbeat notes, persevering notes, bootstrapping to respectability notes, all comfortably performed to the score of a chipper American exceptionalism. In the case of Wiley, the story is somewhat different, but I found myself wondering whether it's much different in the end. Wiley's art mostly centers Black men, a deliberate decision that dovetails with their salience in Obama's signature public-private initiative, My Brother's Keeper, and the privileging of Black masculinity as the site for the negotiation and affirmation of Blackness, its roots traceable to a Du Boisian appraisal of Black identity, is fraught with risk and freighted with limitations. For one, to borrow a powerful phrase from Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak, this, quote, logofratrocentric notion of collectivity, end quote, occludes the Black women and non-binary persons whose labor and vision have been decisive in redefining the political responsibilities and potencies of Blackness in the struggle against white hegemony, from the Combahee River Collective to Alicia Garza and Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives. With this caveat in mind, and it is a significant caveat, I want to examine Wiley as a critic of Black identity's encounters with the machinery of classicism for 2 reasons. The first is that Afro-Atlantic meditations on classicism in the visual arts remain understudied, even though the pace of publications has picked up of late. So Serena Connolly's exploration of Jean-Michel Basquiat's body of work and Heidi Morse's contributions to classicisms in the Black Atlantic, a volume about which I'll say more in a few minutes, are 2 of the most recent and most probing. Wiley's own interventions in classicism have not been the subject of a standalone treatment, although some pre-modern art historians and cultural historians have turned to him lately. Grappling with Wiley offers us a fresh vantage from which to contemplate what Emily Greenwood, in her forking description, threading together Barbara Goff and Michael Simpson's Crossroads in the Black Aegean and Robert O'Mealy's Romare Bearden, A Black Odyssey, has framed as a Black classicism that operates as, quote, an ironic counter discourse that writes back to racism and imperialism, or as a source of mythopoiesis in the formation of modern Black identity, end quote. This insight brings me to the second motivation for taking up Wiley, the care and self-consciousness with which he primes audiences into rethinking the touchstones and baselines of their conditioned investments in classicism. Throughout the global North and its settler colonialist extensions around the globe, these investments congeal around certain visual forms. The subtitle to Lyra Montero's essay-long scrutiny of these forms is, in its own way, a textbook illustration of the argumentative economy that comes to the fore in their study. Quote, white columns, white marble, white supremacy, end quote. As a first approach to the aesthetic and psychosocial underpinnings of this system, though, I want to take a quick glance at Akila Membe's reading of Frantz Fanon in Necropolitics, a nearly inexhaustible resource for those seeking to study the octopoidal movement of late-stage racial capitalism across literature and the arts. One passage from this book has inflected my readings of Wiley's work. Here's Akila Membe. Approaching racial violence in particular, Fanon began with a seemingly anodyne question. What happens during the encounter between the Black and the white? According to Fanon, the encounter is performed under the sign of a shared myth, the myth of the Negro. In actual fact, Fanon clarifies, European culture possesses an imago of the Negro that Negroes themselves have internalized and reproduced faithfully, including in the most anodyne circumstances. What does that imago consist in? In this imaginary economy, the Negro is not a human, but an object. More exactly, the Negro is a phobic object that as such arouses fear and terror. This phobic object is first discovered through the gaze, end quote. The suspicion spurring my various encounters with Wiley's work over the years is that the imaginary economy of interest in Membe and before him Fanon runs on the circuits of classicism, which I understand to be a constellation of ideological properties and material processes that governs the ascription of chronological priority and authority to a specific category of objects. Classicism not infrequently depends on assertions of fictive genealogy and fictive kinship, and inasmuch as these assertions rely on an existing literary and visual vocabulary for their enunciation, the vocabulary under early modern and modern conditions is what of white hegemony is, you guessed it, white hegemonic. This classicism has historically supplied an enormously potent structure for the identification of whiteness with the man, quote, which overrepresents itself as if it were the human itself, end quote, in Sylvia Wynter's trenchant formulation. The production of Blackness is an objectifying medium and of Black persons as non-human objects, and the effortless glide from the visual apprehension of the Black object to the arousal of fear and terror both follow from this overrepresentation. But Wiley has some tools at his disposal for countering and neutralizing the forms of this objectification. Among the strategic visual motifs in Wiley's work that mediate the elevation of Blackness to subjecthood is florality. It is the flowers framing his portrait subjects that open a door to imagining afresh. There are, of course, some wrinkles. For one, in the case of the Obama portrait, despite Wiley's own proffered explanation of the flower scheme in the presidential portrait as indexed straightforwardly to Obama's origin story, when it comes to geographical specificity, plants can underrepresent as well as overrepresent, in no small part because plants are bound up in the same circuits of empire building and settler colonialism that wire through Obama's trans-hemispheric line. Setting aside the surprise that greeted the revelation with the portrait's unveiling that the chrysanthemum had been Chicago's official plant since 1966, something I had no clue about until it was published, or the fact that the African blue lily is actually native to South Africa, we can tell a story for each of the flowers that relates their global movements to the Columbian exchanges and their aftermath. It would be a narrative of botanical imperialism to invoke Elizabeth Pollard's edifying take-up of historian of Columbian exchange Alfred Crosby in a study of imperial Rome's trafficking plants. In the case of the blue lily, the imperialist vector is perhaps easiest to detect, at least if we metaphorize one of the observed features of the plant. I learned while researching that its adaptability to almost any soil type has to do partly with its aggressive roots, which after a while crowd out other kinds of vegetation. Love it. But what appeals more to me is another feature of the plant world that, as given expression in Wiley's artwork, holds promise for interrogating the bounds of the human. It concerns the regime of relation to the air as a unifying property of forms of sentient life, or what Luce Irigaray in the 3rd chapter of her exchange with Michael Marder through Vegetable Being explores under the heading of universal breathing. We are living in real time, in pandemic time, the answer to one of the questions that is asked in their chapter length exchange. Quote, what do our societies unconcerned about air and breathing look like, end quote. If only, Irigaray contends, quote, we were capable of forming every whole while taking air into account. Our totalities would lose their systematic and authoritarian nature, end quote. To do so, we would need to re-examine and recenter our relation to the entities who make our air breathable, the plant life whose photosynthesis generates the oxygen that is a precondition for the evolution of animal life, the oxygen without which we cannot live. So I see in Wiley's plurality, as showcased not only in the Obama portrait, but in his many other works, and here are 3 paintings from the St. Louis collection, a commitment to the recovery and accentuation of an atmospherics for the human form that insists on its interlacing with plant life. And it's with this claim that I will now arrive at an opportune moment for setting out more starkly Wiley's challenge to a classicism that has historically been predicated on an obsession with not just any human form, but the Euro-American man that has overrepresented itself as the only because universalizable human form. Plurality is one of those visual devices through which Wiley's portraiture signals both the indeterminacy of the human form and the ecological rootedness of the body. It's hardly the only device, though, and for the next few minutes, I'll look at a second one that has been equally accommodating for the debunking of that overrepresented man. The original beat of inspiration for thinking more carefully about Wiley came from a painting of his entitled Equestrian Portrait of King Philip II, Michael Jackson, on display at the Seattle Art Museum. One could say, and in fact I have said, as others have, that it's modeled and offers commentary on the Flemish painter Peter Paul Rubens's painting and his broader engagement with equestrian portraiture more generally as embodied in Philip II on horseback, a painting that is at the Prado in Madrid. But that's hardly the end of the story, since Rubens' painting and that broader engagement with equestrian portraiture capitalize on Greco-Roman representations of generals and emperors on horseback. And as Wiley has himself stated, the painting ranges across the length of the Flemish Baroque, quote, from Rubens to Van Dyck. Among the most conspicuous ancient exemplars of the equestrian representational tradition in Rubens's lifetime was the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius that, erected sometime during the later years of the emperor's reign in the 2nd century CE, had been relocated from the Lateran, where it had stood since the 8th century, to the Capitoline Hill a decade or two before Rubens was born. The Flemish painter likely encountered the equestrian statue during his travels to Rome in the early 1600s. What I appreciate and relish about Wiley's visual intervention is how it situates the reception of Rubens and Rubens's own reception of Greco-Roman antiquity as practices that are inseparable from the work of race and racing. The choice of Michael Jackson for this equestrian portrait is key. In the figure of the King of Pop, the agony and the psychosis of what Karen and Barbara Fields have memorably termed racecraft are formulated through a carefully contoured visual grammar. Not only the 2 cupids, one pinning the arm of the other behind his back, but the horse whose coloration grades from white to dusky, in a reversal of the epidermal schema that Jackson pursued over the course of his life, articulate the logic of race and racialization as a type of self-splitting phase change, of Frantz Fanon-style psychosis re-endowed with flesh. The conflict of modern racial identification and interpolation is pitting 2 selves, 2 cupids, set in the forefront, with battlefield violence raging in the distant background. Crucially, for my purposes, all of this play is unlocked by the reception of Greco-Roman antiquity through what early modern moment when the racial scripts by which the person and persona of Michael Jackson would one day be read began to be assembled and circulated. The Philip II, who's commemorated by Rubens, ruled the Spanish Empire in the era of its greatest affluence, when, to its exploitation of gold and silver in the New World and its extermination of indigenous communities, was added the laurel crown of the transatlantic slave trade. The encounter with classical antiquity in the present is therefore, on Wiley's reading, intermediated by the haunting hemispheric legacy of colonizer and slaver violence. To receive the classical, to participate in the reproduction of classicism, is to be confronted with specters of the longue durée, the Mediterranean and Atlantic worlds of Philip II. Wiley's painting both scrutinizes the visual language of Greco-Roman antiquity for its responsibility to modern racial orders and locates the spectacularization of the Black entertainer's body within the constraints of that order. But it's also a summons to examine the conjoining of human and non-human that characterizes the equestrian pose as a form and the histories of mastery and the techniques of mastery through which that form secures meaning. The equestrian figure stands astride the process by which classicism demands and stages animalization as necessary for the racialized subject. Wiley is hardly alone in creative play with the possibilities of equestrian representation, or for that matter, in the turn towards centaurification and other varieties of human-animal hybrid as commentary on the animalization of Blackness. Nandifa Ntambo's photographic composite Europa, which graces the cover of Zakiya Iman Jackson's Becoming Human, is a mind bender in this respect. What the equestrian portrait of Michael Jackson takes to an extreme, though, is a secondary myth, a myth of human proportionality in relation to the horse. As Wiley noted when commenting on the process that led up to his revision of Jacques-Louis David in the 2005 Napoleon leading the army over the Alps, decked out with Timberland boot and squared up against David's rendering at the Brooklyn Museum, quote, "What ended up happening is that I discovered that the scale of man to horse is a complete fiction. Men look a lot smaller on real horses. So they are at the time of David. All those grand tableaux that you see on the wall of the Louvre are propaganda. They are designed to complete the narrative of domination of empire and control. The appeal, I suppose, is that in a world so unmasterable and so unknowable, you give the illusion or veneer of the rational, of order, these strong men, these powerful purveyors of truth," end quote. Jesse McCarthy has lately written perceptively on the face-off between what he terms two visions of mastery in Wiley's work. There is another dimension of Wiley's King of Pop as racializing subject atop color-frequenced horse that calls for comment. With profit, we might read the painting as entering into the conversation that Zakiya Iman Jackson facilitates in Becoming Human, Matter and Meaning in an Anti-Black World, of how best to articulate being human in a manner that neither relies on animal objection nor reestablishes liberal humanism as the authority on being human, end quote. If anything, the pigmentocratic sequencing that both the King of Pop and his horse experience lend weight to one important prong of Becoming Human's argument about the historical and contemporary, quote, bestialization of Blackness. Animalization, Jackson writes, is not incompatible with humanization. What is commonly deemed dehumanization is in the main more accurately interpreted as the violence of humanization or the burden of inclusion into a racially hierarchized universal humanity. Inasmuch as the discourse of race is a discourse of speciation, there is meaningful and regenerative work to be done in unpicking that discourse's historical and contemporary naughtiness. Here, Jackson herself is joining a counter-discourse of animalization as a productive and potentially even emancipatory practice that has deep roots in Black studies. We have still so much to learn, as Joshua Bennett has lately shown in Being Property Once Myself, Blackness and the End of Man, from Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life, whose famous opening paragraph with its placement of enslaved persons and horses in a, quote, all too fraught proximity, yields on sustained re-examination a bracing insight into the prospect of imagining, and this is Bennett again, interspecies relationships anew and moving ultimately to abolish the forms of anti-Black thought that have maintained the fissure between human and animal. This fissure was historically dependent on legal structures that policed the ability of enslaved persons to access horses in the first place, South Carolina's Slave Act of 1722 being one testimonial to the slaver fixations with keeping horse and slave apart. But there are pathways to revisioning classicism and to revisioning a classicism of the Black body that do not reiterate or credential a visual rhetoric of animal coextension. Wiley's work doesn't limit itself solely to the investment of Blackness with the classicizing authority of a man on horseback, as Jesse McCarthy has observed. The equestrian portraits move across genders. But classicism is also figured as an attitude, as a disposition, and not only of the Timberland wearing variety. And it is that dispositional and affective aspect that I want to address next. I've been really taken in recent months by the late Charles Mills' contribution to a volume on anti-Blackness, magnetically entitled The Illumination of Blackness. In this contribution, Mills argues uncompromisingly for Black philosophy as, quote, better suited to carry out the Enlightenment project than its designated legitimate representatives. Being more centrally shaped by social oppression than any of the earlier listed Euro-Enlightenments, the Black Enlightenment is, unsurprisingly, more potentially radical than any of them, end quote. Mutatis mutandis, an encounter with Wiley's Black classicism doesn't offer, in my view, merely or primarily aesthetic play with motifs that are extracted and assiduously manipulated from a classical tradition. It is, I think, an invitation to reflect on the likelihood that there is a Black classicism that is better suited than its historically white and white supremacist counterparts to deliver on the promise of classicism as a system of knowledge. By centering Blackness in its constitutive relationality with plant and animal, Wiley is not merely reversing it and upending the tendency to sideline Black people as participants in a classicism whose functional properties is presumed external to their identities. Instead, he's modeling the practice of a classicism in which Black people set the terms for a project of classicism that is about their identities. To return once again to Mills, quote, no other group has had the distinctive combination of experience, group interest, motivation, brutal racial exploitation, lack of alternative identitarian resources, and intimate and quotidian familiarity with the ideologies and practices of the West to be better located to understand race from the inside, end quote. The more ambitious and more enticing prospect, at least from where I stand, is for a Black classicism that extends its roots in so many directions that, like the African blue lily, it begins to displace some of its adversaries. But you may perhaps caution me against wishing for Black classicism the overrepresentation that has historically been denied it. Perhaps a more progressive prospect is foregrounded in the work of the artist with whom I'll now spend the next few minutes, the Afro-Cuban painter Almonia Rosales, recently the focus of an ongoing exhibition at the Art Design and Architecture Museum at the University of California, Santa Barbara. This exhibition has paid particular and exacting attention to Rosales' engagements with Greek myth and the success of her paintings at recoding these myths in conversation with Yoruba and Afro-diasporic religious histories and practices. My entry into Almonia Rosales' work, and specifically her emphasis on the Afro-diasporic religions that coalesce around the worship of the Orishas, has been profoundly mediated by the playwright Chiara Alegria Hudes' 2021 memoir, My Broken Language. Hudes is so gifted at memorializing her personal growth into the practice of diasporic artistry, and crucially, her evolution into the kind of writer who could weave out of the many strands of her Philadelphia Boricua existence dramas for the stage. In the book's 33rd chapter, she taps some of the pride and excitement that surged during her earliest moments of playwriting as memories hidden and unbidden from her childhood spilled out onto the page. Quote, Mom's spirit world filled every page. My work dripped with Os Santos. Yemaya into stage left. Lights rose on Oshun. Ochosi the herbalist lurked behind a garden scene. Sometimes the Orisha were main characters front and center. Other times they went unnamed, my secret code behind the story. One play had mostly conventional scenes that I interrupted midway for intentionally awkward rituals, sensual, silent moments. In these rituals, an actor moved her body in embarrassing ways when words became insufficient. A ritual to mourn a wife lost to fire. A ritual for a boy's first sexual arousal. Invented ceremonies, the stuff of dreams. But all Mom's cleanings and ebos and possessions lurked between the lines, gave me a physical vocabulary to put on stage. Magic realism, a dramaturg said. The label irked me. You're Greek and Roman gods, my classmates said. You're Romulus and Remus, you're Echo and Narcissus. The comparison annoyed me. Sensual is different than magical, I thought. The Greeks were then, I thought. The Orisha are now. I've been unable to separate myself from this passage in the months since reading Hudes' memoir, and it has furnished me with a vantage from which to contemplate the impact of Almonia Rosales' visual refraction of this same idea. Comparison of the sort that came immediately, might even say reflexively, to Hudes' classmates is a seemingly ubiquitous feature of responses to the work of Afro-diasporic artists who play with those iconographic signifiers that are ascribed an origin story or source to Greco-Roman classicism. You'll notice how Hudes responds to the comparisons. She dispatches the association with magic realism by stressing the gap between magical and sensual, by not allowing the latter to be overwritten into or subsumed by the former. But next comes the decisive maneuver, the counter to that attempt to claim her creative world as simply another expression of Greco-Roman classicism. Quote, the Greeks were then, the Orisha are now. I vibe to the clear-voiced affirmation of temporal distance and priority, even as I strain to grasp its enigmatic many-sidedness. The statement has a relativizing aspect to it. Perhaps from who this is positioned, the Orisha are alive and pulsing, they are here and hers now, whereas the Greek and Roman gods exist as possessions of the past. But would it follow, and would who this be all too happy or reluctant to concede that the classmates for whom this comparison renders her work legible inhabit a space-time in which the Greeks exist now, but only for them? Or is her remark intended to deny any claim to presentness that the Greeks may have for her classmates in the first instance, but presumably for other readers and interlocutors of her work with similar formations? In order to bring out some more of the percussive force that's rippling out from this last question, I want to think more explicitly with paradigms of Black classicism in the literary and visual arts. Lately, I had the good fortune to contribute to a 2020 volume entitled Classicisms in the Black Atlantic, which was co-edited by Ian Moyer, Adam Lechner, and Heidi Morse. As the volume's title signals, the project around which the various contributions coalesce was the critical reception and mediation of Paul Gilroy's notion of the Black Atlantic. In revisioning the Atlantic as the space within which multiple and often conflicting classicisms were formulated and distributed, the editors were alert to several challenges, some more amenable to negotiation than others, and I'll quote. The exploration of classicisms in the Black Atlantic as a transnational chronotope founded on the violence of the Middle Passage and sustained by the crossings and circulations of people, artifacts, texts, and ideas affords several possibilities for classical remediations, as Emily Greenwood points out. On a basic level, the classical past and its discourses have served as one element, one medium in a varied discursive and artistic repertoire through which Black Atlantic intellectuals and artists have been able to represent to a wide world their particular modern experiences and conditions. And yet there are obvious tensions in this proposition. On the one hand, there is the often held assumption that the availability of classicism for reconstructing Black past, presents, and futures is grounded in its universal humanism. On the other hand, there's the historical fact that the classical legacies of ancient Greece and Rome have been appropriated by modern European cultures as dominant as they are hegemonic and have been used to buttress civilizational and racial hierarchies, thus making those classical legacies complicit in justifying racial violence. This tension supplies the basic conditions for several different critiques and remediations of classics and classicism. We emphasize a plurality of classicisms in this book's title. It represents an acknowledgement that the reconstruction of classicisms entailed in recuperating and representing experiences in the Black Atlantic will be capacious and involve the past of Egypt, Ethiopia, West Africa, the Middle East, and other parts of the ancient world. A concern to lodge here, and one of my concerns in thinking through my contribution for this volume and in thinking through responses to this volume, is what happens when classicism of the historically white-centering and white supremacist form occludes the recuperation of Black Atlantic experiences, or even more problematically, remains implicated in their continuing effacement. It is fine, I think, to lift up a, quote, plurality of classicisms, but in a deliberately cantankerous and perhaps unjustifiably zero-summing mode, I will voice the belief that this plurality cannot, and I would argue should not, be kumbaya-listically ecumenical. Dominant hegemonic modes of white-centering classicism have got to go. Otherwise, they will continue to threaten the cultivation and elevation of other classicisms, mainly by hogging cognitive and material resources that are sorely in need of redistribution. We saw a relatively mild version of this process at work in the response of who this is classmates to her plays. There are, of course, more corrosive versions of this. The systematic denial of capital and infrastructure for the expression of Black classicism, unless it conforms to fairly straitjacketing ideas of what constitutes the classical, is one of the more conspicuous. There is, I believe, a future beyond this straitjacketing, and I see some of Rosales' paintings as offering a roadmap to this future's realization. These days, the force of her migration of the gods weighs heavily on my mind as a concentrated visual meditation on the dynamics of the transatlantic slave trade and the matrix of racial, gender, spiritual assignments within which this trade unfolded. Close to hand, as I enter into reflection on this painting, is the insistence of historian of religion Alexis Wells Ogogome in The Souls of Womenfolk, the religious cultures of enslaved women in the Lower South, that we take apart the composite category of slave religion and re-articulate it around the axis of gender. Enslaved women's religious history, she writes, introduces experiences, orientations, and bodies that demand the construction of new methodological approaches to the study of religion and slavery. Although captive females' experiences of capture, transport, and sale paralleled in many ways the experiences of their male counterparts, their dismemberment engendered a triple consciousness. It was this triple consciousness, this awareness of their mutually constitutive subject positions as women, slaves, and caretakers that lent a distinctive hue to their remembrances. The conditions under which women witnessed their children die, experienced childbirth, participated in sex, maintained relationships, and reared their dependents shifted drastically as their bodies and wombs became the primary currency in a global trade. The rejoinders to these meanings became the basis for their religious cultures, aimed at countering the dismemberment brought by their enslavers, securing a better quality of life, and ensuring the enslaved community's survival. The challenge that Wells Ogogomez's Souls and similarly books such as Jessica Marie Johnson's Wicked Flesh pose to my historical sensibilities about the intersection of religious expression, mass enslavement, and the access to classicizing one's own and one's community's own lived experiences boils down to this. On the one hand, the Middle Passage was culturally annihilative, and its ravages culminated in forms of epistemicide whose silencing effects surround us, all of us, on every side. On the other hand, the many millions trafficked on the boats brought cultural and religious practices, world-making practices with them that did survive and do have a claim to entering into the canons of classicism. Rosales posed a crucial question in an artist talk that she recorded back early in February. How did it survive? In the face of historical and contemporary forms of oppression, suppression, and erasure, how do the gods of the Middle Passage survive? In Migration of the Gods, the Yoruba gods themselves are figured as making the transatlantic journey in several dimensions. First, the seascape of the Middle Passage is conceived to encompass human and non-human entities, most prominently the Orishas with their gold halos. In this seascape, even the water is animate, frothing and churning as it crashes into the land. This aquatic energy vibrates at the same frequency as Alexis Pauline Gumb's Undrowned, Black Feminist Lessons from Marine Mammals, one of several recent Black feminist treatments of the deep blue sea of the Middle Passage that called out to me as I contemplated the painting. But core to the painting's visual logic is the figuration of those godly beings who travel in the company of the enslaved. Some of these beings are gendered as women, beings for whom the importance of caretaking from the backbreaking work of carrying those who cannot support themselves to the nursing of those who cannot feed themselves is conspicuously emphasized. And the carceral violence of enslavement is signaled by the painting's inclusion of Ghana's Elmina Castle in the background, triple consciousness in pictorial action. What is spatialized in the painting has a temporal vector as well. And here we move now to what I see as the painting's most singularly captivating feature. I'll submit, as I begin to wrap up, that Migration of the Gods exemplifies a mode of classicism, not just classicism in the sense of value, but classicism as a technology for manipulating, organizing, and prophesizing. Because even as it comments on the past of the Middle Passage, this is a classicism that kinetically propels that past into a future. And it is a future that I think can be named. It's a future that's activated in the past already. And Andres Sanchez Calque's 1599 painting, Los Mulatos de Esmeraldas, the subject of a recent essay by Baltasar Fra Molinero. Taking issue with aspects of the painting's curation at the Museo de América in Madrid, Fra Molinero advances an Afrofuturist appraisal whose original inspiration he credits in part to a viewing of the movie Black Panther. The English is on the slide. I'll read the Spanish. Se trata de ponerse en los ojos de los tres caballeros mulatos y del propio artista indígena que propone un cuadro oficial en el que los retratados son representados con autoridad. Esta autoridad es una formulación de un futuro posible. Unos descendientes de negros y indios se ven compartiendo el poder o al menos una parcela de este poder. Porque ser retratado y nombrado con título honorífico en el propio cuadro es sinónimo de tener autoridad. Estas tres figuras autorizadas que se envían desde las Indias al rey de España representan un momento de crisis en la estructura del poder español, un futuro que cuestiona la hegemonía racial llegada de la península ibérica. Los mulatos de Esmeraldas constituyen una construcción pictórica, una ficción que comparte objetivos con las ficciones especulativas afrofuturistas del presente, las novelas de Octavia Butler o Samuel Delany, que son proyectos epistemológicos en los que se predica desde una perspectiva histórica afrodiaspórica que los negros existirán en el futuro y no como simple heraldes del caos que los negros son el futuro. There are Black people in the future, is Alicia Wormsley's message. But the communication I discern in Fran Molinero's reading of Sanchez Galque and propose to apply to Rosales' work is that Blackness is the future. To recognize and respond constructively to the demands that this future will make of us, and especially those of us whose disciplinary formation has proceeded along right-centering and privileging lines, we need tools that are appropriate to the work of dialogue with artists such as Wiley and Rosales, and with those traditions of Black classicism that their paintings celebrate. The Orishas who survive in the teeth of the Middle Passage's unholy violence are bearers of the truest classicism. Truest because most resilient, truest because most exactingly tested. They are the sources of inspiration and strength for that brilliant future in which the power to classicize will rest in the hands of Black people, that luminous future in which classicism is all Black. Thank you very much.